All right, let's just dive right in. We're about to peel back the layers on, well, reality itself. We're going to explore a really wild idea that the world you see, the space you're in, the time that's ticking by, what if it's all a massive, beautifully constructed illusion?
So, let's kick things off with the biggest question of all. The world you see every day, is it actually real? I mean, really, this isn't just some late-night philosophical question anymore. It's something modern physics is forcing us to look at head-on.
You know, our gut feeling, our common sense, tells us a pretty simple story. Time is like a river, always flowing in one direction. And space, well, it's just this big, empty box that everything sits in. But modern physics comes along and says, nope, not even close. It paints a picture where time is a flexible, stretchy fabric, and space itself can be warped and bent. It basically flips everything we thought we knew on its head.
So where did our old, comfortable ideas start to fall apart? Well, the first big cracks in this foundation of reality appeared in the early 20th century, and they came from the mind of one guy in particular, Albert Einstein. He gave us this incredible, reality-shattering concept called time dilation. The big idea here is that there's no universal clock ticking the same for everyone. Time is actually personal. It literally slows down the faster you go, and it gets stretched out by gravity. Think of it less like a steady drumbeat and more like a rubber band.
And this isn't just some abstract theory. We can actually measure it. Look at this comparison here. A clock up in orbit, where gravity is just a little bit weaker, actually ticks measurably faster than a clock down here at sea level. Your phone's GPS has to correct for this every single second. So if time changes depending on where you are and how fast you're moving, then it can't be the absolute, unchanging thing we always thought it was.
Okay, so if the outside world is that weird, what about our inside world? I mean, how are we even perceiving any of this? This is where it gets really interesting, because the next piece of the puzzle suggests that you're basically walking around wearing a biological VR headset.
There's this idea called the interface theory of perception. And what it says is that we don't see reality as it truly is. We can't. It would be way too much data, just overwhelming. Instead, our brain creates a simplified user interface for us, kind of like the icons on your computer screen. You see a little blue folder, you click it, but you're not actually touching the ones and zeros and the complex electronics inside. You're just using the handy little icon.
This VR analogy really makes it click. Take a look. In a virtual reality game, you see a rich 3D world with objects you can interact with. But what's really there? It's just a bunch of electrical signals and pixels being rendered by some software. Well, the theory suggests our reality is the same. We see a world of solid objects, but behind that interface could be a buzzing, infinite ocean of quantum data. And space and time, they're just the operating system our brain uses to render it all so we can, survive and find our next meal.
So, let's push deeper. If our senses are just an interface, what's behind the screen? What is that infinite quantum data? This question takes us down the rabbit hole into the deepest and strangest layer of physics we know, the quantum realm. And down there, our everyday rules for space and time seem to just completely dissolve.
Down at this tiny, fundamental level, you find things like quantum entanglement. This is where two particles can get linked in such a way that they essentially share a single existence, no matter how far apart you pull them. They're like one thing in two different places.
And here is the truly mind-bending part. If you measure something about one of those particles, its twin, its entangled partner, reacts instantly. Not at the speed of light, but in zero time. It doesn't matter if they're in the same room or on opposite sides of the universe. It's instantaneous.
So what in the world does that mean? Well, one of the most staggering interpretations is that at this truly fundamental level, the space or distance between those two particles doesn't really exist. It suggests that distance itself is an illusion that just kind of pops into existence at our scale, but isn't real at the bottom.
And it's not just space that gets weird. When physicists tried to write a master equation for the entire universe, it's called the Wheeler-DeWitt equation, something very strange happened. The variable for time, the little t that you see in almost every other physics equation, it just vanished. It's not in there. The math describes a reality that is fundamentally timeless.
Right, so if space and time aren't as real as we thought, that opens up some absolutely wild possibilities. If reality is more like a field of potential, does our consciousness get a vote in what becomes real? This is where we can start to look at ideas like the law of attraction, not as magic, but as a way of consciously interacting with this map of reality.
So let's look at the law of attraction through this new lens. If we imagine a block universe where all of time, past, present, and future, already exists, then the law isn't about creating something from thin air. It's more like choosing a new coordinate on that map. It's about shifting your conscious awareness to a different reality that already exists as a potential.
We can even use quantum mechanics as a metaphor for how this might work. See, in quantum physics, a particle exists in a cloud of all possibilities until you look at it, until it's observed. Then it collapses into one single reality. So if we apply that idea metaphorically, the process becomes pretty clear. First, you have to see all the different outcomes as real possibilities. Then you use your focused intention, your observation, to choose one specific outcome. And finally, that focused observation helps collapse that potential into your actual lived experience. You're not creating it, you're selecting it.
Now, what is so fascinating about all of this is that these cutting-edge, mind-bending ideas from physics and neuroscience, they're not actually new. Not at all. In fact, they sound a lot like what ancient spiritual traditions have been saying for thousands of years.
For example, in the ancient Indian philosophy of Advaita Vedanta, there's a central concept called Maya. And Maya is basically the idea that the physical world we see, with all its separate things and people and the passage of time, is an illusion. Not in the sense that it's fake, but that it's a projection, like a movie, created by a single, unified consciousness.
This famous quote from the poet Rumi just captures this idea perfectly. It's saying that you aren't some tiny, separate person just living in the universe. You are the universe. You are the entire ocean of consciousness, just experiencing itself from the unique perspective of a single drop. So, let's tie all these incredible threads together. We've looked at Einstein's physics, at brain science, at the quantum world, and at ancient philosophy. What happens when we put it all on the table? Well, it points to a pretty profound conclusion about who and what we really are. Let's just quickly connect the dots. Relativity shows us time is bendy. Perception theory says our brain is a VR headset. Quantum physics hints that space itself isn't fundamental, and ancient wisdom has been talking about this for centuries. All of these different paths, from science to spirituality, seem to be leading to the exact same unbelievable place.
And here it is, the big takeaway. Space and time aren't a prison that we're trapped inside. They're more like a sandbox. They are the software, the game engine, the consciousness uses to have an experience. Think about it. Without the illusion of time passing, you can't have a story. You can't have growth. And without the illusion of separation in space, you can't have the joy of connection. And that brings us to one final empowering question. If you aren't just a character playing a part in this grand story, but you are the consciousness that wrote the script, if you are the architect of this beautiful illusion, what story are you going to tell next? What reality will you choose to observe into being?